I'll call the meeting to order. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we are in Treaty 1 territory, the traditional homeland of the Métis Nation. I'll introduce the panel members first. Brent McIntyre to my left, Cynthia Stevens to the far left. Assessor today is Jeremy Poole, and the Secretary is Kelsey Harrison. I'm Marcel Larondo. I will be chairing. We will be hearing applications for revision of assessment roll in accordance with the Municipal Assessment Act. The matters for which a revision is requested have been described in each application, and we will limit the discussions to those matters. The statements that applicants or the assessor make at this hearing are sworn testimony, and anyone speaking to the matter must be sworn in. Be advised that comparisons of assessment of properties are not considered evidence of market value by the Board of Revision. The Board of Revision is appointed annually by Council and is independent of it and the City Administration. It makes its decisions on the basis of the evidence provided at this hearing and issues a written order that will be mailed to all parties as soon as possible. Please note that the Board's decision with respect to an application may be appealed to the Manitoba Municipal Board if the matter pertains to assessed value or classification, or the Court of Queen's Bench if the matter pertains to an application of exemption from taxation. Should you wish to appeal, information on how to do so will be included in the Board order. With respect to the hearing process, I will confirm the matters to be addressed with each applicant following the swearing in. We will then have the assessor's testimony followed by questions that the applicant may have, and then the applicant's testimony followed by questions. Each side will have an opportunity to summarize if they wish. Once the evidence about an application has been brought forward, the applicants may leave and the process will repeat for each item on the docket today. The session will close after all applications have been heard, and the Board will deliberate in private and make its decisions. You will receive the order by registered mail as soon as possible. As information, all public hearings are recorded and will be part of the public record. Please have your cell phones on silent. And before we start, just a little bit of housekeeping. We're going to break sometime around noon, so when we finish one, if it's a little earlier than noon, we're going to stop for half an hour. We'll grab a bite to eat, then we'll come back. Everybody's aware of that? Thank you very much.
Would you like to swear in or affirm? Could you please state your name?
Sure, right.
And do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Swear in or affirm?
Swear.
Could you please state your name?
Rod Salon?
And do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
Yes.
Jeremy, when you're ready, item number 1 will be 820 Taylor.
820 Taylor, roll number is 12097803655. We have a preliminary issue with non-compliance. We turn to page 15 in my brief. They've reported the stall count, and they've reported the stall rate. They haven't reported a total parking rent, what they're collecting on the site. They indicated 1,000 stalls are being rented out at $22.43 a stall. We had this issue last time I was here with panel, with 2 of the panel members today, so we're fully aware of 22-3 James's order for non-compliance for parking parameters. That is the basis which I'm asking for. Before I go any further, I do want to ask the appellant that this is indeed collecting rent. They are collecting. No. So this is
property's vacant.
okay. So
There are 1,000 physical stalls, is what they're telling me.
So I just want to confirm before we go forward. When I took this picture, obviously I didn't take the picture, this is a new order, but this was right at the reference date. So you have approximately, you just look at the picture, about half occupied. So they're confirming that there is no income stream here for parking,
Correct, owner-occupied property currently.
and they don't charge their employees anything. The sign he was filled out incorrectly.
They have 8 employees that currently pay the $22. It's an internal rent, it doesn't mean that.
I would draw that up compliance.
Thank you. Now we'll move ahead.
This property is assessed at $23,627,000. If you look, if you get back to the pictures again, page 12, near a photo of the property layout. It's Hydro's old headquarters. it's pretty much, what we have on file is that they've moved the majority of their operating staff out of the building. But then when we looked at the actual photos, when I'm seeing the photos, I'm seeing a half-full parking lot, right at the reference date. There was no employees, there would be no cars there. As you see it from the site layout pictures. On page 14 as well. 15 is the I&E, which we've indicated, again, they indicated 1,000 stalls with rent being collected on it. At that point, I'd be adding an income stream in. But if this is only people paying, and this was filled out incorrectly, I'll take David on his word. As you can see, it's owner occupied, and they do report the costs associated with the property on page 19. So there is no rent in the property, so we have to come up with rent for the property based on the market. On page 3 is our comparables for OFC rents. 50 comparables. The stock area leasable space, or space that leased up approach the reference date was 323,950 square feet. The average was $12.13. The weighted average was $12.80, and the median was 12. Tight range. For the vehicle service garage portion, we reviewed approximately 200,000 square feet of leasable area. The average rental rate was $14. The weighted average was $14.42, and the median was $12.62. And for the storage component element of the property, we reviewed storage rates close for approximately 295,000 square feet. An average rental rate of $9.12 with a weighted average of $8.97 with a median of $9.63. The income streams, we have a vehicle service garage of approximately 41,000 square feet. We have an average rental rate of $8.60. We downgraded the rent, and also due to the size of the property, to $8.60. We put on our standard parameters. The leasable area 41,062 square feet. We have a potential rent of $353,336. A vacancy of 4%. Our expenses at 2%. Our shortfall at $4.50. Produces a net operating income of approximately $325,000, capped at 7.05. Gives us a capitalized value of approximately rounded $4,610,000. For the OFC portion, the office built portion of the property, we have 175,962 square feet with an average rent of $9.46, a little bit below market. The leasable area, again, produces a potential rent of $1,664,607, capped at 10.5%. Vacancy 10.5%. Produces an effective gross income of $1,489,823. Again, our 2% and expenses and $8.50 per shortfall gives us a net operating income of $1,302,981. Our capitalization rate is 7.55%, and that gives us an estimated value rounded of $17,258,000. The storage warehouse is on page 8. For 25,672 square feet, we have an average rent of $6.42. It produces a potential rent of $164,750. There's a vacancy of 6%. Expenses at 2%. Our shortfall for a warehouse would be $3.75, which produces a net operating income of $145,994, capped at 8.3%, gives us rounded capitalized value of $1,759,000. So with all that said, on page 9 is our income summary. Overall, the building, the property itself, has generated a potential rent of $2,182,695. Our vacancy occupancy loss is 9.11%. Expense, which produces an effective gross income of $1,983,893. Our expenses, again, 2% right across the board. And our shortfall, which is blended obviously at $7.70, produces a net operating income of $1,774,000, approximately capped at 7.51%. Gives us our estimated market value of $23,627,000 rounded. So with that, we have below market rents. We feel we've been checking for that. At $23,627,000. We feel it's reasonable.
Rob, questions?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Pohl, you mentioned you are aware that the office building is 100% vacant?
Well, our records show that, but like I said, when I was looking at the photographs, we saw a half of a lot, which didn't indicate that, so.
Is there any recognition of that in the valuation?
As far as vacancy, no, we have a standard vacancy.
You would be aware from the presentation last year on the property that there's significant deferred maintenance. Has that been recognized at all in the valuation?
No, it has not.
The rent comparisons that you showed on page 3, and I'm just speaking of the office building right now, not the industrial. These would, to the best of your knowledge, include main floor retail.
We did an analysis of 50 comparable properties. Yes, there would be some main floor in there.
Okay, that's all the questions. Thank you.
Brent, any questions?
No, it was answered with the vacancy.
Cynthia?
I just had a question about where, in the photographs, where the other, so obviously the office building is quite obvious, where the other two pieces are?
At the back.
Like at the very back, by the
Yeah.
rail line there? In there, okay, thank you. Okay, I just wasn't, okay, that's all I had, thanks.
Has there been any inquiry of whether they're mothballing this place or what they're doing with it?
We're not sure, we're not.
Nobody's.
That's why when I was looking at the non-compliance element, I see 1,000 stalls, I see them collecting rent on it. Did we miss an income stream here? Although it would be minor compared to parking, but we saw half, I mean, I wasn't there at the time taking the picture, but half of the lot was full, which would indicate the building would not be vacant. Who was parking there? Fleet vehicles or didn't look like fleet vehicles, so.
Are you aware the service garage is being used still?
I couldn't comment on that. Our records over there is basically vacant.
Okay. And for these land, you've got 869,896, correct? The, they also own the lot next to it?
I didn't check that, was it?
They own the one behind it. That's, oh, that's right, they put it as part of this land, didn't they? Yeah, you did block it in. Where the service garage is in the back?
Oh, here, no, they own that, I thought you meant here.
Yeah, this
I
part.
didn't check this.
That's where the service garage is, isn't it? On that back rectangle?
Yeah.
And the building in front of that is the storage one?
Right.
The office is on the left, and then,
Yeah, the main building here is,
So does this include everything on this property except for that museum that's there? Is the museum not on, there's an electrical museum or something in there?
I don't believe we have any rents attributed to that.
Yeah,
So it's everything on here except for that, okay.
you don't have it on yours, I don't think.
I didn't see
You
it.
got
I
it?
think so, because we both have the same area, and ours includes that second industrial building where the museum is.
Oh, it does include it, okay.
Okay, we didn't have it flagged as a museum.
As-
or something,
Where-
so
where-
maybe it's just,
You put it in storage?
Let's see.
Because that's it right there, right?
Yeah. that still exist?
Yeah, it's in the, I believe, anyway, I can't specifically answer for the city, but I believe it's in income stream 1.
Okay, thank you.
Or, sorry, it is 3, one of the two.
One or two?
One or two.
1 or 3, 2 is the office.
Okay, no further questions. Let's hear your presentation. You may
I
answer.
just have one more. Are they actively trying to lease this?
All we have is what's committed on the IDs, and the IDs were as received, and then they had a rental rate, which showed up this year, and then a parking lot that was half full, based on their report, when it, like, if it's mainly vacant, which our records show, that lot should be half full, there should be no parking, so that was part of the, policy.
Okay, thank you.
At what point, I do have another question then, at what point, when the vacancy puts it into a stall factor, do you put it towards land value? Because land value out there would be tremendous.
Or we would have to look at it, the reasonability of, would you tear down that building, or how would it go back? Like, would that be, would basically the income stream of that property justify still having, at this point, we would still be keeping it on, whether it be vacant, or whether the property would just go through, like similar property, someone would have to redevelop it. There'd be existing value there, that's a whole different analysis.
Okay, let's hear your side of the story.
Mr. Chairman. So Mr. Pollard described the property. We have pictures on page 3 of the first tour of the office building, which is now 100% vacant. It was the headquarters for Manitoba Hydro, and they eventually moved all the staff out to the downtown location. And the bottom picture is, you can see the combination of service garage and what the city has called warehouse buildings, which include in this picture the museum. And on page 4 is a overhead map of the property. You can see that the office building is in the top right corner at Taylor and Harrow, and behind that is the substation, and then the combination of warehouse and service garages. To the west is the parking lot, which services all of the buildings. I've confirmed with Manitoba Hydro that currently there are 8 employees only that lease at employee rates for the parking lot, so it's basically vacant. Through 2018, they were downsizing the staff to move out. I'm going to try and streamline this presentation, and I'll just tell you at the front of basically what our position is, and that is 1 year ago, for the 2019 assessment, Manitoba Hydro brought this property, the assessment, forward with concern. And the concern was that they now had a vacant building, the office, that had a considerable amount of deferred maintenance. They had a report done by a company called BFA in 2013, and at that time, the company identified $58 million worth of deferred maintenance that would be scheduled to be required to be done over a 10-year period. They then broke that down, and I'll refer you to this in a moment, but I'll just describe it. They broke that down in timeframes of what was imminent, what was required up to 3 years, 5 years, and then 10. If I may pause for a moment, I'll refer you first to that document, and then I'll refer you to some pictures of the property. The document, the report that I refer to, is included in our evidence starting at page 47. This is a report again done, an asset detail report for the office building alone in 2013, July 22nd. And the next 20 pages are all of the items, and you'll see in the third last column on each page what the priority date is. Now keep in mind, this is 2013, so as we exist today in current physical condition, we are 6.5 to 7 years down the road. So what was considered imminent is beyond imminent. What was considered necessary in 5 years is now imminent, etc. This evidence was brought forward 1 year ago to the Board of Revision. We asked that the board consider one of 2 options. Number 1, for ease of valuation, if we accepted what the city is doing, because what their model is producing is, in their minds, a fair assessment for this entire property, notwithstanding the deferred maintenance that's required. So we said, if we were to accept that value, and just make it simple, because we could nitpick all the different areas of it, but let's get down to the brass tacks. If we accepted that value, we have to recognize at least what at that time we considered imminent. And I'll show you in this report, what was considered imminent is a minimum of $5 million. In my opinion, it's closer to 17. So the easiest thing to do is put yourself in the mind of a potential purchaser at April 18 with full knowledge of this report, looking at what you would hope the market value would be, and then of course making the deduction of the required maintenance. We still don't think that brings us to a proper value because of the amount of maintenance that's still required after that point. Nothing has changed since that date. The only thing that's changed is the last remaining employees in the building have now moved out. The building is completely vacant. If I could pause for a moment before I go to the conclusions of the report and refer you to pages 23 and forward. These are pictures of some of the office floors. So basically, they just moved out. They decided, we're not going to do any of this work. We don't need this building. We're moving our employees to the downtown office, and we're going to hope for the best. Now, Mr. McIntyre, to your question, what is their plans? They're still working on that. What they don't want to do, from what I understand, is become property managers. That's not what Manitoba Hydro does. So leasing the property has not been a top priority. They would have to do all this work to bring it to a leasable condition anyway. So they're not really wanting to invest a lot of money to go into a business that they're not really comfortable with. Their ideal would be to try and sell the property. That hasn't happened yet.
Are they not constricted by that hydro substation, which is all part of the one property?
Yes, they would have to retain approximately 1/4 of the site. They would probably retain the entire quarter that you see with the substation and the industrial buildings. And the rest, they would hope to sell the building. The parking lot would service the building, and that would be the approximately 15 acres plus improvements that they would sell.
Are they still using the service garage?
Yes.
Okay, so the office tower is vacant, but, okay.
Yeah. So basically, what I'll be describing in our approach is that we have no contention with what the city has done on the remainder of the site. It's just the office building. The office building has been valued without consideration of the significant deferred maintenance, and that has to be recognized from a market value perspective. So I'll just give you some main facts, and this is kind of reiterating the position that we had when we came forward last year. Just to be clear again, that the property as a whole has a number of different assets. The primary one that we're focused on is the 4-story office building plus basement, that was built in 1957. And this is the asset that requires $30 million, but ultimately up to $60 million of work. The Electrical Museum and Education Center is part of, as I mentioned, I believe it's the warehouse section of the property. That's
What
just
page are you on now?
I'm just reading off page 5, just giving a general description.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. And also included in the additional assets is the vehicle repair shop, which again, yes, is still in use. And then, of course, the hydroelectric substation. I don't think this is an issue in contention. We have in our evidence a section of the Hydro Act which states, although the city has followed this, that those assets are not taxable.
Which asset?
The actual substation.
Yeah.
In total, the site is 20 acres in size. So to talk about the analysis of the deferred maintenance, I'll ask you to turn to page 8, and we go into our summary of that 22-page report on the deferred maintenance items. What that report basically stated is that there were a number, 22 pages worth, of items beyond useful life. Remember, the building was constructed in 1957. And they had timelines in 2013 of between 12 months and 10 years for replacement. The cost to remediate and bring the property to a leasable condition must be accounted for in the valuation of this office building. We have total costs identified as priority 1, which back in 2013 was in a 13 to 24 month timeline. And what I'll do is go from page 8 and I'll refer forward to the different conclusions of the report. So if I can ask you to turn to page 69. What this is the first of the summaries of the items in kind of a chronological priority. So what they consider category 1 is replacement of all exterior windows and the curtain wall system. That had to be done then. and it still hasn't been done. That was $5 million, $5,607,000. On the next page is the HVAC requirements, which they call category 1 and 2. And they said at that time these should be done within 2 to 3 years. And if you keep going through that report to page 72, you'll see that those HVAC requirements are $5,372,000. The next page, on page 73, goes through the electrical, which they push ahead at the time in 2013. They said you've got about 3 years before you really need to address this. That was just under $2.5 million. And then the final section that concludes on page 77 is various interior components, category 1 and 2. In 2013, they were told you should do this in the next 3 years, and that totaled $4 million, $4.1 million. That's just the summary of the most imminent items. In my mind, what we should be stating is that whatever we think the value is in a typical condition, we should be deducting that full amount. What we elected to do in 2019 before the board is only ask for the $5 million that we consider definitely has to be done. Nobody can occupy the place until at least that's done, and nobody's going to be comfortable until the rest is done. So at the very least, we have to look at deducting $5 million. That's what we brought before the board in 2019. Otherwise, the values were fairly similar. The city was a little bit higher at that time than they are today, but basically all the other facts are the same. Nothing else has changed. And I'll ask you to flip one more time to page 44, where you'll see the conclusion of the board revision based on the evidence then, which is the same evidence today. And that was a deduction in value of approximately $5 million. So to make this short and simple, Mr. Chairman, nothing's changed. The only thing that's changed is we're 1 year further into that timeline of imminent repairs, which in my mind would bring the value lower. We, at the time, did a secondary approach. I put less weight on this because it gets more gray. But that's on page 11, and what that was saying is if we are to ignore what the city's done and try and determine a value based on very low market rents that recognize this basically unleasable condition, where do we end up? And through that process, we came to the conclusion that actually the city's market rent that they apply might not be too bad, as long as we recognize the condition. And where we recognize the condition, there's different areas you can do this. We could further suppress the market rent. We could address the vacancy allowance, because the fact is it's 100% vacant. Whoever buys this building will have a vacancy period. They'll have a risk of vacancy over the life. They'll probably want to convert it to multi-tenant occupancy. That will be a significant amount of costs. And of course, then you've got all of the other costs that I'll talk about as a second part of this discussion, which is the non-recovered expenses. This is a perfect example of a building that will be incurring significant non-recovered expenses if anybody buys this to either occupy or lease. So where we recognized it, though, is in the capitalization rate. Now, on page 13, we have our analysis, and I think I've gone through this presentation, or at least all of us have with all of these, so I'll try and cut a short version. The short version is, though, that the last cycle we had asked for a cap rate of 9% if we were valuing this without deducting the deferred maintenance. Sorry, 9.75%. And that was accepted by the board. What's happened since the last cycle? The last cycle was based on a reference date of April 16. We're now at April 18. And what has happened, actually, for the first time in 10 years, is that the fundamental factors which influence a capitalization rate, the greatest being the cost of money, for the first time since the recession in 2008, cost of money is increasing between April 16 and April 18. What we show in our report is that as the cost of money goes up, mortgage rates follow. And as mortgage rates go up, of course, investors require a greater rate of return over the cost of the money that they borrowed and that pushes up cap rates. Those conclusions are found in graphs on page 14 and finally 15 that shows as you have an average 10-year bond rate, which has been decreasing, especially since 2008. We had a blip in 2008 and then it's come basically down. And there'll be a spread between that bond rate and what cap rates are. And the cap rates usually lag a little bit behind. But the fact is, an investor, when they're looking at what sort of rate of return they'll require in April 18, they'll look at factors like this and they'll realize that if the cost of money is going up, I'm going to want a higher rate of return than I would have for the same asset, let's say, a year or two ago. That's reality. That's what's happening in the market, and that is why we're suggesting there should be no compression unless you have economic factors which outweigh that impact, which would allow you to feel confident that you could appreciate your asset enough to cover the cost of money increase. You'll see at the bottom of page 15 that the market is basically agreeing with our conclusion. And that is, for the first time, there is not a compression in cap rates between April 16 and 18, largely due to the cost of money. So you'll see that between the broker studies in Q1 of 2016 versus 2018, the conclusions are basically static, zero compression. So recognizing those factors, we asked the board to consider, if they weren't deducting the deferred maintenance, to apply a much higher capitalization rate to recognize the investor's impending costs. 9.75 was selected, and we asked that that rate again be used for the reason that nothing has changed except we're now further into the timeline of deferred maintenance. Now, on page 20 then, we have a conclusion. Sorry, I'll take you to page 19, because basically we're accepting everything else of this property except the value of this office tower. So on page 19 is just that income stream. And what you see here is basically accepting everything the city's done, except the capitalization rate. There's no way that this property would trade in the market in its current condition at anything less than a cap rate that we're showing here, certainly not in the 70s. The ultimate value then for only the office building is $12,600,000. That works out to $71.61 a square foot. Now, we feel confident in this value because it's the same evidence that we brought forward a year ago, the board agreed with. We feel confident in the evidence because of the evidence provided from an income approach standpoint. But we also feel it's interesting then to do a test of that value of the office building, $71.61. On page 17, we talk about some cap rates in the market that I'm not relying on for this report, but an interesting one was a sale for a building right across the street. And I think we've talked about this before. It's the Canadian Wheat Board building.
Which page are you on?
Back to, page
Not
17.
across the street,
Yeah, well, down the street, yes.
quite a ways.
Yeah, okay. Actually, you're right, because I walked past it through the snow as I walked here. It's further than I thought. This is an interesting sale to look at, because it again is a large, single-occupant office building that was put on the open market, took 2.5 years to sell, and when it eventually sold for a rather compressed sale price of $76 a square foot. The difference is, the Canadian Wheat Board building had $10 million of deferred maintenance invested in the late 2000s. The market still had concern about two factors. It wasn't enough, and secondly, anybody buying this building likely won't get a single tenant like they had when they vacated with Canadian Wheat Board. They're probably going to have to convert it to multi-tenant. And I know this property firsthand because I was involved in the team that had a due diligence done for a different potential purchaser who elected out for these reasons. If you have a single tenant building, it's very optimistic to think, I'm going to get a single tenant and everything's going to be great, never mind the deferred maintenance that we have to do. The fact is, you'll likely have to convert this to multi-tenant. That creates an erosion in your leasable area. It obviously will cost a lot of money, and it paints a very different picture of your return in the end. And that's what happened with the Wheat Board building. So I think it's an interesting apples-to-apples comparison, except for the fact that they had spent $10 million already. And I'm asking the board to say, if we're going to compare apples to apples, we have to make a deduction from our property or increase the cap rate. That's kind of the logic. A second property that I thought was interesting, I have pictures of on page 28. This is a property at 1075 Portage Avenue. It had been the province that occupied it, where driver's licensing was occupying most of the building. And they put that on the market, and it eventually sold. First of all, it's much smaller than the subject property. It's 68,000 rather than 175,000 square feet. But like most suburban offices, it also has the supporting parking. You need that parking in order to generate the income in a suburban location. So they have an equivalent size parking lot for the size of the building, 190 stalls in this case. Again, the difference was this building was in average condition at the time of sale, and the entire property sold for $5.5 million, which was $82 a square foot. Again, something less than what we typically see for that size building, and the reason is that an investor is probably recognizing that, am I going to find a single tenant for this whole building? And if I don't, what are the costs that I'm going to have to incur? And what are the expenses that I'll have to incur to attain occupancy?
Sorry, what did you say that sold for a square foot?
$82.
82, thank you.
Yeah.
I missed.
For a building in average condition, unlike the subject property, and
Yeah.
a quarter of the size. So, Mr. Chairman, that is basically our presentation. That if we accept what the city has done in their valuation, except say, you can't ignore $58 million of deferred maintenance, 17 of which is imminent, 5 of which we're asking to deduct. You can't ignore that. So we ask the board to consider two things. Make the deduction of $5 million from the city's value, or work through, as we have done, a different analysis that applies a higher cap rate to reflect the deferred maintenance. Either approach, we think, brings it in at a fair value that's supportable by a couple fairly comparable properties that have sold the market. The last thing I'll mention, Mr. Chairman, is you brought up a great question, which was one of the first questions I had when looking at this property, and one of the questions I had for Manitoba Hydro when I inspected the property and met with them. What if you raise the building? Sell the site, at least the 15 acres that you can sell. At this time, they're not comfortable doing that. I won't go into the details of why. But if we did, I did a quick analysis that I didn't include here because it's very hypothetical, but just for the comfort of the board, because I know you're thinking the same thing I was. I looked at market sales in the area. At first, when Manitoba Hydro sold the Shindico, it was around $12 a square foot for a smaller piece of land. I upped that for time adjustment, but recognizing I'm also talking about 15 acres, I used $15 a square foot. That would put the value of the land at about $13 million, but we still have to recognize the demolition costs. Long story short is, if we're looking at highest and best use, I do not think you will get a value higher than what I'm proposing here if you elect to value the property as vacant land and demolition costs.
When you're talking Shindico, you're talking the land to the west?
Yeah, they sold, Manitoba
Yeah.
Hydro sold
Yeah.
some land
Yeah.
for the Walmart.
Yep.
They needed some extra land there. So that concludes our presentation. We ask for a revised
Questions?
I just have a few. Page 44. Altus's appeal to a recommendation for 2019.
That's correct. At the time of the,
To the municipal workers.
yeah, when Kerry Reimer presented this a year ago, he wasn't comfortable, as I'm not, saying that we should only be deducting $5 million. He had a feeling the owner would say, why only 5? We gave you a report showing the amount. So we appealed it to make sure until we had further direction. I can't answer today for Manitoba Hydro, but I think they'd probably be satisfied if they make sure that the value doesn't change.
Okay. For your report, obviously it's independently done, and it's good, looks, what I see is what I see. How much of this would you consider capital cost versus deferred maintenance?
I can't answer that, Mr. Cole.
Neither can I, just from this page.
Yeah.
We're quite in agreement that capital costs aren't to be taken off of assessments or factored into assessments. That was well proven. The last recent one, I'm sure you're aware of it, would be this report with Mr. Sid Story and Mr. Michael Kortback for 299 Fourth, where there was a substantial amount of millions of dollars of work in the parkade, and the board ordered not to take that deferred cost and take it back to net present value, take it off. So it answered that.
So to answer your question, of course, there is a very large percentage of what we consider deferred maintenance in this, and the reason I say that is, when I look at capital improvements, those are things that I consider to be enhancing the value of the property that already is considered leasable or occupiable. But if you have to do things to make a property leasable.
But the next question I have is, you're saying it's not leasable. Hydro left because they amalgamated on their main tower. They didn't leave because the building just simply couldn't be occupied anymore. They chose to leave the building, it wasn't at their building.
Yeah.
So it's not at that level of, you couldn't have someone move into it.
No, I'd suggest it is. I don't think anybody would get an occupancy permit at this stage, and I don't think any tenant would be comfortable in that space without addressing a number of the concerns addressed in that report.
The OFC building itself.
Yes. Yeah, just the OFC building. Everything else is fine at the site.
All right, that's all I should have.
Brett?
No questions.
Cynthia?
Just a clarification of, so when did Hydro effectively move the majority of their staff out of that building? How long has it been sitting there?
When I was there last year in the summer, there was 4 people working there. When I was there, prior to
Must
that.
be lonely.
Yeah. Prior to that, I'm just trying to think at the time, we started working for Manitoba Hydro in 2015, and our contact, Teresa Van Dien, the lawyer with the appraisal side, her offices were at 820 Taylor. So in 2015, 2016, it was probably 80% occupied. They started then moving everybody out. Teresa moved out, I think, probably 2 years ago now.
Okay, so there still was in 2015, so in 2013, when this report was done, there were occupants in that building?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, that's all I have, thank you.
Rod, you answered one question. You were there a year ago. You haven't been there since?
No, I talked to him actually on correspondence right now with Mark Pauls of Manitoba Hydro to make sure everything is as it was, and the confirmation is yes. And I asked him, is there any updates on plans for the property before I go in and speak to the board? No.
I think everybody knows my views about people that leave a building to deteriorate and then expect the city to subsidize it. Is that what we're at now? We're gonna continue to let the building go down and keep trying to drop the value?
No, if that was the case, we'd be asking for land value only. I mean, we're trying to be realistic, get to the point of what a potential purchaser would pay for the property. And we can't ignore these deferred maintenance items. And Manitoba Hydro, I'm sure, has no intent of leaving the building vacant to deteriorate. But they have a white elephant on their hands, and they're trying to do the most responsible thing that they can. In the meantime, they shouldn't be taxed as if the property didn't have these concerns.
But they've had an opportunity to do some of the upgrade, like at least some of the maintenance.
No, they basically elected to, why are we gonna put money in if we're gonna leave it vacant? Leave this for a potential purchaser, they can worry about it.
Have they mothballed it? Shut down the heat, shut everything
No,
down?
no, there's still 4 people working in there. They still have controls in the basement for some of the infrastructure. And that's another part of the reason why they can't just demolish the building right now. They have to move that out, which is possible. They have locations selected if that need be to move that equipment out. But there's 4 people working that.
It's an awful big building for 4 people, though.
Well,
You're gonna be quiet.
You don't have to worry about a lot of interruption.
That's kind of where I was getting at, like, I mean, I'm not denying what you're saying, I take you at your word, but when I'm looking at the photo, I saw what I saw on a timeline right at the reference date, indicating that there had to be a building. Like, I mean, it is what it is, right, the photo is what it is.
Yeah, I mean, Mr. Chairman, I will say that I have confidence in Manitoba Hydro are being good corporate citizens. Our question here today is, what is the market value of the property?
And part of the problem, has anybody talked about the kiss and ride that goes on there with people parking their cars and taking the bus?
I don't think that's occurring right now. That was one of my questions of Mark Pauls. Is there anybody parking in the spots? He went and confirmed there's 8 people paying whatever they pay, $22.
That's the hydro, but how about the other people that are coming on the lot?
I don't think there is at this point.
Oh, they put signs up now?
I don't know, but when I drove by there on the weekend, I couldn't even access the site because they have some construction along Taylor.
Yeah.
But my understanding is that nobody's using that right now. I could be wrong.
Well, it's not revenue, it's just people using it.
Right.
Yeah, I don't, even if it was some auxiliary income coming in, I don't think that would be an investment type. I mean,
No.
Yeah.
The fact is, anybody buying this property needs that parking lot to service the property, so it's kind of part and parcel.
Is this the first time you dealt with it, Jeremy, or you dealt with it last year? No, you
I
didn't.
just dealt with the municipal court file that was opened by Altus.
Yeah.
They appealed their own value, which is kind of not typical, but I mean, given the fact that, after talking to Mr. Reimer, I can see why they feel they're about it. It's just a matter of, looking at it on a go-forward basis. And like, when I'm looking at this report, I can't, I mean, it's gonna take more work than I can do at this level of appeal to come up with what's deferred maintenance, what's capital costs. It'd have to have a greater look. We may be heading to need some more.
And being the Little League, you know, we shouldn't be dealing with these big numbers, but we're gonna do our best. You know, we're gonna take a 5-minute break, if you don't mind. We'll call the meeting back to order. Our next file will be 333 Broadway.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, we will be withdrawing that appeal.
Okay, we're trying to go ahead and sign off.
I'll have to grab the sheet.
That's fine.
Been a little
You
bit.
can do it after.
Yeah.
There's no hurry. I like the sound of that already. And number 3 will be 55 Princess. I don't know how you managed this one.
Well, it didn't have a copy, but now I got 2 copies, so
No, you got one?
No.
I think aren't you missing?
She gave you only one.
What? No, give me this one and give me this one. I got yours and then I got this one.
No, you give me mine back.
Oh, smokes.
I don't know, maybe it's wrong.
Thanks.
Maybe it's tied up with another.
You give me mine back. You had your own.
Like I said, I'm a bit off today.
It's one of those days. 55 Princess, when you're ready, sir.
Roll number is 13060033 100. Assessed value for 2020 is $3,324,000. Actually, year built to this property is 1919. There was a effective year is put on in 1963. There was an addition put onto it. If you look at the leasable area, it's 53,203 square feet. It's the right-hand column. Let's just get straight to the building. Page 10.
Ken?
Page 10 shows the area for the building, as well as some side area views. Vacant, the property is currently vacant. Property is owned by Management Hydro. The report, sorry, on the following pages, the past page 11. Page 12 is the INE. The building is vacant, my understanding. Follow through, there's no reported anything except for page 16 costs. I believe the last tenant that was in the building was us. Flip through to page 23. Is the 2018 order vision till then. Value was dropped from $3,060,000 down to $2,353,000. And the decision of the panel was based on the net, adjusted net operating income and capitalization rate of 8%. So we go through that
Is
process.
that page 23?
24.
Reduction.
But I thought they confirmed it. Page 23 is the
Classification
classification, oh, classification liability confirmed.
We go through Altus's submission. The rental rates that are put in place are as such, on page 9, and the work is on page 30. So Altus was asking for a little bit over $2 million. The last rent that we have in place is on like page 34. Winnipeg was in there, started September 1st, 2011, and ended August 31st, 2014. And it was leased out for $5.25 a square foot. Aside from that, I don't have any other rental information on the property. So we'll go back to start the workup. We have it classified as an OFS. These OFS rates are obviously for general property. We don't have anything approaching the $5, what was deemed market, I guess, at $5. So these are our standard comparables. I looked outside of that and I went to storage. Again, our storage, page 4, is again significantly higher than what we have it in. The market rent that we put it in at was $4.91 for the storage warehouse component and $6.53 for the OFS component. Given that market rent that we had, we were the last tenants in there at $5.25. I think that's pretty reflective of what the property could be leased out at. Overall, I think it's based on the reduction for market, significant reduction for market. The potential rent that we have in there is indicative for the property could generate. So I'll go through the workup now, both income streams. So for 29,999 square feet, we have $4.91 for the storage warehouse. It produces a potential rent of $147,295. $6% vacancy. Expenses at 2%. Shortfall at $3.75. Produces a net operating income of $128,938. And capped at 8.3%, higher cap rate than what typically would go on. Produce a value of $1,552,000. On our next page is the OFS portion. At 23,204 square feet, we have $6.34, which produces $147,345. Vacancy at 5%, or 5.5%. Produces a type gross income of $139,241. Expenses at 2%, shortfall at $7, produces a net operating income of $127,522. Capped at 7.2%, gives us an estimated market value of $1,771,000. The summation of those two income streams are on page 7. Total value is $3,324,000. Given that the last arm's length rent was started in 2011, lasted 3 years for $5.25, I think that's pretty reasonable. It's right there. Not all the questions.
So 2014 then.
Is it short-term lease?
Okay. Question?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, Mr. Paul, you're aware that the property has been vacant since they overheld that lease, so at least 2016. And that arm's length lease was, as you mentioned, for $5.25 a square
Right.
foot. That's just the 3-story office building in the garage, not the substation. Okay. On page 3, you list a number of suburban office rents. Are any of those comparisons in the Exchange District?
No, like I said, these are just general market rents that we have on both pages. My point was that we downgraded the rent significantly to the point where you're not gonna find market rents like this, so at $5 or $4, so.
Yeah, but the search to determine that wasn't with comparable properties, it was with suburban office.
We haven't talked to the storage warehouse and all that.
So the property is classified by the city as a suburban office, despite its location in the Exchange District downtown.
No, OFS just means throughout the city, if you're 3 stories or under, we get an OFS. So if this was a 4-story building, we would put an OFD.
Okay,
Or
so
OC or OFD, however it would be.
Yeah, if I understand correctly, though, that classification, of course, drives the rates and allowances that the model has determined for different types of properties. So if this was, just for argument's sake, considered a Class D building, the vacancy allowance would be 14%, I think, is that
Correct.
correct? And if, it shouldn't be, but if it was considered a C, it would be at 10.5%.
Yeah, but you also wouldn't be getting a $4 rate or a $6 rate.
Right, but if you actually looked at properties that were in the downtown, rather than suburban office, perhaps you would come to a different conclusion on market rents as well.
I was following the rationale of the last order and the information that was presented from both appellant and assessor. So when I'm looking at the value that we put on place, in everything all inclusive, I think when you put it under market rent, what we have on it, that takes away from the risk of vacancy. I think anyone could go with it for $5.
Sorry, what was the defining characteristic of OFC versus OFC, S? It was 3 stories?
Basically, an OFS is 3 stories or lower.
3 stories or lower. And of course, capitalization rate is also driven from that classification as a suburban office. Okay, those are all the questions.
Cynthia?
I'm just, so in looking at the photos, what's the split on the space there? Do you know, in terms of the warehouse and the office?
Well, it's actually a storage warehouse, it's basically.
Oh, I was just trying to get a sense of the build, in looking at the building here on page 11.
That would be the office.
Okay, and then it looks like Hydro's using that to park some, their equipment there, is that?
That's not on the roll.
This is not, oh, because it looks like Hydro trucks,
No,
okay.
the roll is just in the red.
Right there, okay, all right. Okay, that's all I have, thank you.
Brent?
When the city leased this premises, did they make any improvements?
I don't believe so. It was just a short-term lease, for, just for the police department. Bear with me here. Let's see here, but I believe it was for the police as they're building their, building. So, yeah, it was, I don't believe that they would put anything.
So you never inspected it?
No.
That's all my questions.
I guess, your cap rate, why would the OFS have a 7.2 instead of the 8.3?
That's just our standard parameters that we put on it. My point was, if you're gonna have a $5 rent, there's gonna be little vacancy or little risk that you need a $5 rent. Anyone could lease that for $5. If you put a market rent of $12, $10, yeah, now we're gonna have to adjust for vacancy. Now we're gonna have to look at it in a bit different way, to reflect the actual likelihood of an income stream moving into that property. When you put a value of $4 to $6, average about $5 for rent, that's, there's not a lot of risk there, so that's the rationale behind it.
And they haven't done heritage on this building, have they?
Don't believe so.
Yep.
It's heritage status. Sorry. Apologize, I didn't have that in my script usually.
Would the heritage status change what you're looking at on the cap rate, or?
There's limitations on what you can do with a heritage property.
Right.
But I mean, the argument comes down to, are you actually gonna change it? If you have a heritage building for an OFB or an office building, I should say, and it's gonna consistently be at its highest best used to be an office building into the future, there really isn't much risk to changing what you can do. There's a bit of extra elevated cost to actually keeping the facade, keeping it the way it's looked. But as far as changing this building here, I don't think they would. It is what it is, it's an old building in downtown.
Well, we don't know what the heritage status is on it, so.
No, I missed that, I apologize.
If we looked at the vacancy rate, is it because it's a S, that you're looking at
SWH.
a vacancy of 5.5?
Yeah. Yeah, your storage, that's 6% standard for storage warehouses. And then we put a 5%, 5.5% on the OFS based on the rents that are in place.
So you did that because of the rent? You used to get the 6?
There's not, no, what I'm saying is there's not much risk to a $5 rent.
Yeah.
When you undercut the market, like anyone can move in there, use it for any purpose for $5.
But you can't recoup your cost with $5 rent.
Hmm?
You're not gonna recoup your costs at a $5 rent.
When we downgrade the rent to this point, like, I mean, it is what it is, like, I'm not saying it's a high investment, great property.
Empty since 2000, well, since the city moved out in 14,
I didn't,
14, 15. I mean, is that not reaching its top potential of being a higher vacancy?
if we would be giving higher vacancy, I'd be putting back model rents on it, and then I'd be increasing the vacancy based on those market rents. But when we downgrade the rent, you can't put a high vacancy rate, like a 15% or 10% or around that range, on a $5 rent. Otherwise, yeah, we could put 10, 15% if we're gonna be putting a rent range between $10 and $12, which I don't think is realistic, based on what's occurred in the property.
So this isn't a true model, then you've had to adjust the numbers.
Yeah, the rent, sorry, I thought I made it clear, we adjusted the rent downwards in our preliminary review of the assessment. These weren't model generated rents.
No.
That's why I spoke to it the way I did, like, you see where the market is,
Mhm.
there should be a relationship to it, and there just isn't for this property, so we downgraded the rent.
Downgraded the rent to, for the office building?
Yeah.
What was the rate again? 635?
Yeah, and the storage rate, when I reviewed it, the last rent inclusive for the building was about $5.25, so.
I don't,
It
that-
it
doesn't
depends,
seem-
like, we could've went the other way with it and given a higher
Yeah.
vacancy, but I don't think in this case it would be realistic to what's occurred with the property and how the board's valued it prior,
Have you visited the property? No?
which is just filed for
We'll
this.
see.
I believe Ms. Trojan visited the building
We'll find out if Rod visited.
on Monday.
On with your presentation, Rod.
Can I have one last question, Mr. Chairman?
Sure.
Yeah, just following on some of that conversation. Mr. Full, on page 34 and 35, you have a copy of that arm's length lease that was in place that you referred to. On page 35, there's a breakdown of the floor, or it describes the different floors. And you agree that there is a basement, main floor, second floor, third floor, is that correct?
Yeah.
So it's a 3-story office building.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you,
Go
Mr.
ahead.
Chairman. So 55 Princess, it's really, this property is really 2 different buildings. To answer your question, yes, I've inspected the property. It has the building that faces Princess, and that's the civic address of the entire property, it's 55 Princess. Essentially, that is the office building. There's a main floor garage, you can see in the picture on page 2, where the garage is, and then it's a second story which goes to a third story at the back, all through that kind of L-shaped building. On the other side, which faces King Street, and you can see on page 3 how the 2 buildings kind of work. And it's not the entire facing of King Street that's the office actually extends into this building on King. Essentially, that address is called 55, sorry. It's an address on King Street, and what that is the, and you see at the bottom of page 2, it's the substation. So this is the original substation for the generation of electricity for most of downtown Winnipeg. It's very aged, and basically it needed to be replaced, and that's why Manitoba Hydro built the Adelaide station. The original plans for that is that they wanted to occupy in the exchange again, using heritage buildings, and that way they keep the frontscape of the buildings and keep the character of the area, but also accomplish what they needed to do for the generation of electricity. But it was decided that they couldn't do that because of their heritage buildings, you can't change them. So what they had to do was purchase land just outside of the downtown core at the Adelaide site, and they built a new substation there. So this substation is still winding down. They anticipate for maybe 5 years more they'll use it, but it's done. So again, there's 2 buildings, the office and then the substation, which is the city has valued as warehouse. As Mr. Pohl had mentioned, the office had been occupied by a lease by the Winnipeg Police Services. This was, I guess I can say it now, the Vice Squad offices. They've since moved into the new police station. They held over their lease while the police station was being constructed because timelines were off. And they were still there when I inspected the property in 2016, I believe. They since vacated. The property has been 100%, this is, I refer only to the office building. The office building has been 100% vacant since that time. On page 16, sorry, are some pictures for the board's reference of both the garage and the office, and there wasn't much I could do about pictures of the office because it was inspected at the time the police were still there, so it's not a place you're allowed to take pictures. And then the substation on the subsequent page, and then the basements as well. The office building, even at the time of being occupied by the police, is very dated, requires a significant upgrade. The effective age for both buildings, although they were built in the 1919 era, the effective age is considered 1960. And yes, Mr. Chairman, both properties, Princess Street facing property and the generating station on King, are both heritage. I have excerpts from the City of Winnipeg on pages 36 and 39 that talk about the heritage status of each. They're actually provincially designated. So, in valuing the property, you followed a similar analysis to the city. And again, I'll focus on the office side of the property, and I'll talk about the substation last. We're basically accepting the value on the substation. So it's really the contention lies with the office portion. It was an arm's length lease with the police, and they paid $5.25. It's a main floor garage and 2 floors of office, and basically a semi-finished basement. They just threw some gym equipment in the basement. In our opinion, that was market. When we look at not suburban offices, but rather space, similar space in the Exchange District or in the downtown of Winnipeg for class, what we call C and D properties, that was not out of line. We've accepted the higher rate that the city has applied now of $6.35 a square foot based on the comparisons we show on page 9. So, no contention with the city's application of $6.35 a square foot for the market rent, which we feel is market. If I can ask the board to turn, please, to page 47. We have in evidence the assessment parameters that are the guide to the model that we discussed in questioning. You'll recall that this is a 3-story office building. And if we look on page 47, the definitions that the city has for the difference between an OFC or OFD versus OFS is 1 to 2 stories. 3 stories or more, they call them OFC or OFD. This is clearly not a suburban office. I don't even agree with what the city does in their manual, but even if I did follow this, it still is considered an OFD. The fact is, the manual, or the model can call it anything they want. It's an OFD, it's not suburban. And the reason that's so important is because the data that is inputted and then pulled from the model will be based on the types of properties in that category. For example, suburban office usually are going to be newer properties. They're going to have higher rents, they're going to have a lower vacancy, and they're going to experience lower capitalization rates. So I think it's completely inappropriate to take a property like this and lump it in with a completely different class of property, knowing that the model will spit out a very different sort of value. But even following the city's parameters, this is an OFD. And what that means is, on page 48, sorry, I'm going backwards here, page 50, I apologize, of the manual, You'll see that various vacancy allowances are applied based on the types of properties. As mentioned by Mr. Cole, the OFS receives a 5.5% vacancy, but you'll see that OFD, the market vacancy allowance is 14%. And we agree with what the city's doing here. We agree with what their model is telling them, that as you have these older types of assets that you have in areas like the downtown, you will have a higher risk of vacancy over the life of the building. Again, this building's 100% vacant. But I'm not asking for a chronic vacancy, to be fair, because Manitoba Hydro has not yet elected to put this property on the market for lease. Again, they're not property managers. They don't really want that. But certainly, we shouldn't look at this and apply anything higher than what a typical vacancy allowance would be for what it is, and that would be 14%. So that's the main contention we have here, is that it should be 14% vacancy allowance. The shortfall rate is basically the same, so I'm not going to spend much time on that, but again, we're following the model for OFD rather than OFS. We didn't touch upon this item in the last discussion, but we remain of the very strong opinion that there was no justification for the change in the non-recovered allowance from 7% to 2%. I have in evidence the entire report, but I can maybe save that for a later discussion. But the point is, for this type of property, especially when it's vacant, if I'm looking at buying it, I know that I'm going to experience significant costs in bringing in any sort of income. And that would be reflected in my valuation. So long story short, we're asking for 7% again rather than 2%. And lastly, the capitalization rate. We feel that this property should not be receiving a capitalization rate which is based on the rates achieved for suburban offices. We go through the same rationale on the cap rate. We talk about the fact that there really hasn't been any changes in the market on cap rates. What we see in the city's valuations, and if I can ask you to turn to page 57 and 59, or sorry, not page 57, I apologize. No, I'm sorry. What I will state is that the manual unfortunately doesn't state anymore what the cap rates are for the different properties. They state what the vacancy should be, they state what the shortfall should be, they don't state for the cap rate. But in examining the capitalization rates for OFD, I can state that what the city applies typically is 8.05%. That is consistent with what we've argued in the past for the property. It's consistent with the cap rate, or close to the cap rate that's on the similar aged substation. You saw 8.3%. The one thing I'm going to ask the board to consider is something that was alluded to in questioning. These properties are heritage status. We have been mentioning in hearings that, and I'll be clear about this isn't anything against heritage status. In fact, I think it's a fantastic idea. But there are consequences, there are costs, there are expenses. It's why you have almost universal opposition when a property enters onto the nominated or heritage list. And I think there's a very interesting decision that I'd like to refer to on page 59. This is not a subject that has been deliberated much in Manitoba, and I know that we should give lesser weight to decisions from outside provinces, but when it has to do with a fundamental principle, like how the market considers heritage status and evaluation of a building, I think this is a pretty germane decision. It's from Calgary Assessment Review Board. It has to do with a retail use property that is located in the central core of downtown Calgary, constructed in 1911 with additions in 1929 and 1957. It occupies 18,966 square feet. The subject is described as notable, rare, and unique, and has a potential historic site designation, but has not yet been designated as such. This is the equivalent here in Winnipeg of being on the nominated list. It's when people start to say, well, something's going to happen soon, and then once they hit the heritage status, that's when there can be restrictions on potential use and expenses that need to be incurred when you try and do something different with the building. Again, I agree with the principle, but if you're the owner of a property, these are very real expenses that you have to face. This decision talks about that. does the overall capitalization rate reflect the risk associated with even being on the potential site list? On page 61, I'll quote what the respondent was saying. The respondent submitted an inventory of evaluated historic resources in the city of Calgary. It pointed out that the Historical Resources Act requires the city to pay compensation for any loss in economic value. So in Calgary, they even pay for economic loss, something that we don't quite do here. The city does have grant programs, but right now they are all subscribed. And again, I'm not saying that we're doing anything wrong, I'm just saying that this is a reality. And on page 62, what the board's decision was is that because of this uncertainty, even if they were to be compensated, they don't know to what extent they may be compensated. This creates an unease in an investor's stomach. This is exactly what the capitalization rate is supposed to reflect. If you're looking at an income stream and you feel any unease about it, you will require a higher rate of return. They agree with that concept, and they suggested that a 50 basis point adjustment be made from 7% to 7.5%. No matter where in the country this decision comes from, the logic, I think, is very similar to what we're facing here in Winnipeg. There's investor unease. We need to recognize that. What we have suggested in previous presentations is that 50 basis points may be a little aggressive. Because again, as a fan of heritage buildings, I recognize that you can actually have some positives to that. Some tenants prefer to be in heritage buildings. But you cannot escape the fact that to attain those tenancies, you're probably going to have higher costs. And the fact is, the net between the pros and the cons of heritage status obviously is a negative because of the universal opposition to it. There's a reason why people are nervous about this status. We ask for a 25 basis point increase to the OFD capitalization rate applied typically of 8.05%, which brings us to 8.3%, which is actually a uniform cap rate across the whole property, which is what should have been applied in the first place anyway. We accept the city's valuation as it is, not necessarily the rates or allowances, but the overall valuation for the substation. So the only differences are the difference in the vacancy allowance, the non-recovered expenses, and the capitalization rate, which brings us to a revised value on page 13 of $2.699 million. And that is all. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Jeremy, question?
I don't know.
Fred?
I just have one question, and either party can answer it. Could be on Mr. Slaughter's. So on page 3, the aerial shows definitive lines between the substation and the office building. Are these not on two different roll numbers?
No, the substation, it's a little messy, but if I can kind of show here. So we have a square assessment parcel in the center of the lot, facing both Princess and King. The office building is where the red dot is, but it actually extends through to the first, this whole section here that goes out to King.
Okay.
So if you're standing in the offices on that third floor, you look out the window, you're actually looking out onto King here. And it extends down a little bit, but basically the substation is this section here that you see the two next sections.
So the substation is at the bottom here?
That's right, yeah.
Okay.
So in the picture on page 2, you've got one picture from Princess Street looking at the office building. You're kind of looking from Princess at the office, and then the other page, I'm standing south of the building on King, and that's the substation. That's at the southeast corner. So it's like a big concrete, typical substation.
Right east.
Okay, that was it.
Cynthia?
So you stated that, I think you stated that hydro is, there is still some use for this substation at this point?
Yeah, they think another 5 years.
Okay.
For the substation only, the office.
The office, yeah, okay. All right, that's all I have, thanks.
So you said the substation is still functioning today?
Yes. I didn't think it was, but Mark Paul's the contact, he said, yeah, another 5 years, they think they'll keep it running.
I thought substations were tax exempt.
I think the equipment is, this is a very contentious issue.
It is on the other property,
Well, that's an external
It's
substation.
not sitting in the building.
Yeah,
but the internal ones,
it's a very good question, Mr. Chairman. I don't know if I want to go into this right now.
because it's
The
not
high-
really storage, it's actually,
Yeah, it's necessary, what those buildings are is an aesthetic surrounding. You don't
Yeah.
need to have a building. It's an aesthetic surrounding. The Hydro Act actually says that, all the different equipment needed for the generation of equipment obviously shouldn't be taxed. Nor should the land below it, which is a contentious issue, you'll hear about it sometime.
I've been in on that hearing.
And they actually mentioned plants too, and that one's gray. One side could say that, well, what you're talking about with plants is these surrounding buildings that are only there for aesthetic purposes. You told us to build it, so it looks prettier. We shouldn't be paying taxes on it, or the Manitobans that shouldn't be paying taxes on that. That one's a little more gray. But that, to answer your question, everything inside there is not taxable. The building, I don't think it should be either, but we're not arguing that today. We have an appealed classification of liability.
well, I know you didn't, but City of Winnipeg built this thing, and it sold it to Manitoba Hydro. It was a substation.
Yeah, it's-
I've never, are there other substations that are liable for tax?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you'll be hearing of them this round. Only on the value question until, because this is another thing that Manitoba Hydro has directed us, they want to be proactive. If there's gonna be a decision on this, they want to sit down with the provincial assessor and the city assessor and work this out proactively so it doesn't affect the municipalities. But it is a live issue.
Because they exist outside of the city of Winnipeg
Yeah.
as well.
Exactly.
Mhm. They do. But more and more they want them internally. But they don't want them outside anymore. They're telling them to put up shelves.
It is an ongoing issue.
Not
Looking
in
at-
contemplation today, I'm just talking about
Yeah,
value.
I know what the legislation says, but, so looking at the picture that you supplied, and we call it storage, if the substation's still in there, how can we call it storage?
That's a good question. I mean, you can't use it for anything else. It's really a hypothetical situation. If we must value it, how do we value it? What is it? It's a great big concrete structure built in the 40s, I think, to house hydro equipment,
Which is still in use.
which is still in use, right?
So how can we put a rent in here for storage?
What else would you do with it? Would you say it's not leasable?
It's a hydro substation. And under the act, hydro substations aren't taxable. So how can we use a substation as storage? I'm just asking the question.
Mr. Chairman, to be fair to the assessor, I don't think that's a question he can answer. It's a hypothetical
Yeah,
valuation.
Not that I'm trying to dodge the question, but honestly, I think that's a position that's gonna be beyond my desk to take.
It's if it went on the market and was no longer a substation.
Then-
Yeah.
Yeah, but today it's
I
substation.
don't know.
So how, we can have our discussions.
Yeah.
The other question, you said you already visited it, you asked that, answered that right off the bat. The- Was there any values established when the city sold Manitoba Hydro these properties?
That's a good question. I'm not aware.
Have we investigated the sale to see if they put values at the time?
And how long ago would that have been, I don't know if the.
Glenn Murray was our mayor, so
Yeah.
It's a long time.
Yeah.
that's not that long. Is it?
Sure.
I mean, there's a lot of stipulations involved in that sale. That's
Yeah.
the reason we have the hydro tower.
Mm-hmm. But, again,
But you're right, somebody probably put values on these properties at the time. I'm not aware of them, but it's a good question.
I'm done. Interesting.
Oops.
Well, not that-
Just gonna grab a water.
We're moving along quite well, actually, guys.
because it is just not nice up there.
Is it?
Snow is.
Yeah, it's coming down.
Not nice up there.
More and more. Yeah, we'll go home. We are gonna move on to 330 Portage. Are you leaving?
Nope.
You can if you like. You can if you like.
That'll
It'd be a lot easier.
That'll shorten the meeting. What did I say?
Roll number is 120934833000, 330 Portage.
File number.
Pardon me?
You gotta read the file number too, remember?
Oh, sorry, file number is 193350. Assessed value for 2020 is $20,563,000. It is a downtown OFB property, built in 1971. It has a lease of layer of 150,000 square feet. If you turn to page 12 of my brief, I'll show a photo of the property. Kitty corner to the MPS Center, building. The I&E is as follows. On the next page, you submit a income statement. It's approximately 16% vacancy in the building itself. The rental revenue for the date in place is $837,524. Management recovery-free issue is no longer an issue. I believe all this is without question accepting that management fees are covered, and 5% is additional costs, so that's no longer an issue. Is that on page 18 shows the management fees that they're being charged with covers in relationship to it. On page 20, or page 3 of their income statement, they have a net operating income of $621,993. And the rest of the items is shows their stacking plan itself. I apologize that the numbers are small, but I can only print them in the format that they give it to me.
I thought maybe it was my glasses,
Well, it could be.
because I sure can't.
I can't read it either.
I can't read one of them.
Well, it's
I'm
also,
going like this.
it's also the colors of the,
Like this, I can read them.
Okay, so if we get to my comparables on page 3. Comparables 28, 29, and 30 are actually within the subject property, $13, $13.91, and $14.50. Leased up in 16. Again, the same standard OP comparables that we're using this cycle for 373,000 square feet of inventory. The average rate was $14.96. The weighted average was $13.99. The median of 14, so very tight range. Cushman Wakefield reported their average net rental rate for OP downtown properties at $50.31. So a bit below that. On page 61, it's the Johnson report. If you look down, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lines up from the bottom on the Class B, 330 Portage. There's about 20,000 square feet of vacancy in the building, and advertised at $16 net asking rate. So, look at the workup. That's on page 6. Page 6. We have 123,238 square feet. Produce at an average rate of $15.18 a square foot, which produces a potential rent of $1,624,000 $715. We have a vacancy, because there is some vacancy within the property, and the property itself, in particular, I've looked at it a number, this one in particular seems to have a little bit higher on average vacancy. Some years it's at market, some is a little higher. So we put a vacancy this cycle at 50% to reflect what's going on in the property. That produces effective gross income of $1,381,000. Our expenses at 2% and our shortfall at $11 gives us an operating income of $1,150,045. Capped at 6 3/4 gives us our value of $17,038,000. For the class 40S, that was for the 60 feet portion of the building. For the 40S portion of the building, it's 26,925 square feet at $12.59. So again, still within range, and produces a potential rent of $330,986. Again, same standard parameters that we just talked to, produces the $3,525,000 rounded, which gets us back on page 6 to our $20,563,000. We've accounted for the vacancy that's within the property. The market rent that we put on the property is within range. And it's also within range of the actual 3 leases that we stuff in the building, being 1391 and 1450. So with that, which questions?
Go ahead.
Thanks.
Questions?
Yeah, I just have a few. Thanks, Mr. Paul. I don't want to spend too much time on this. I think we discussed it in previous hearings, but the Class B comparisons that you show on page 3, just to be clear, those do include main floor retail and suburban locations?
Yes.
Yeah. And you're aware the Cushman and Johnson reports, those are all asking rents, not actuals.
I will disagree with that. Cushman Wakefield, if you looked in the history, they are showing the weighted net and average, they actually put weighted net rent in prior years. This year, they seem to have, you seem to be alluding to, it's not in my brief, but it's in yours. Do you not have it in your brief?
Yeah, it's right here, where
Which
it
page?
mentions that they're asking rents.
Which page?
Page 60?
16?
60?
60?
In the middle of the paragraph for market overview, the last paragraph, you'll see that the statement is the overall asking net rent in 2017 was 8% higher compared to 2016 with rents in Class B and
Yeah,
C.
but you seem to be correlating the table on the left, which correlates back to that, which is not the case. My opinion is that's not, you use this rental rate in prior cycles, 1286 for the 14 cycle and the subsequent cycles. So we have both used this rent. I don't believe that's an asking rent, otherwise it would be stating that's an asking rent there.
Okay, we'll leave that as we'll agree to disagree then. Thank you. You agree that the property has had significant history of vacancy?
Elevated periods, yes.
The city, again, has elected to reduce the non-recovered allowance from 7% to 2% for the valuation of this property. That's all the questions.
Brent?
No, I have no questions.
Cynthia?
What, do you know what the school exempt portion of the building is?
I believe it was the province.
It's WRHA?
Yeah, sorry, Winnipeg Regional Health moved in.
Oh, WRHA?
Yeah,
Okay.
sure. Province. For the province.
Yep. I think that's all I have, thank you.
And I've got no questions. Rod, on with your presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Now, Rod, I don't know what you bring up. Go ahead.
Well, we are asking for a revision. It's not significant. We think the city has done a fairly good job in this case, but there are some factors that we think need to be adjusted for a proper market value conclusion. Page 2, we have a photograph of the building. It's a Class B office tower. It is connected to the walkways. It's just west of the MTS Arena. Mr. Pohl has gone through the description. It's a fairly standard building, built in 1971, 17 floors of office space. Nothing much to hone in on really about the description of the property, except that it's undergoing significant improvements right now. Basically, it's performed very poorly over the last decade. And the management has now decided that they have to keep up. I'll start by, I mentioned this in previous hearings, but there's an underlying background to what's happening in downtown Winnipeg for offices that affects the valuation of any of these types of properties. Number one is that we have supply outpacing demand. It's predominantly in the Class A, but that the effect of that, which is massive, has crept over into the Class B, because there's been a flight to quality, basically. People are leaving the Bs to take advantage of the low rents and As. But the overall effect is that we have only about 100,000 square feet of positive absorption typically in downtown Winnipeg, and we just brought on 330,000 square feet of new space. We're going to have a negative effect in the downtown office market for the next approximately 3 to 5 years. We've seen this happen before when Manitoba Hydro constructed their tower. Basically, Central Gas moved out of one of the Class B buildings, and that started a domino effect of musical chairs, a race to the bottom, basically. Vacancies went up, rents went down. It took years for that to bring itself to a stabilized level again. And that's what we're facing in downtown Winnipeg. So that's the background of what's happening. But the fact is, this property had already been performing poorly for years, for a decade. And I'll get to that when I talk about the vacancy. So things have gotten worse. All managers of properties are facing a very grim reality that if they're going to compete, they need to invest in their properties. I was actually at lunch yesterday with a gentleman from CBRE, and we were talking about this exact subject. And the topic of 220 Portage came up. It's kind of off topic, but it's interesting because that's kind of a poster child of where most buildings have to go. They have to put in a ton of money in order to just be competitive with a decreased demand. Let's talk about that for a moment as well. I talked about the effect of supply. At the same time, what's happening in office around the world is demand is not increasing. There's consolidation of companies. There's more of a centralization, a downgrading of space. The average space per person in office 10 years ago was about 180 feet. You had an office space, you have about 180 square feet per person in your office. That's been decreasing over the years to the point now we're in the low 100s. And what that means is, of course, there's less space required. So demand is either decreasing or steady, and supply's gone up. That causes disruption. It's at this time, with this background, where property owners and managers have to invest money just to stay competitive. And that's non-recovered money. It's at this time that rather than increasing the allowance for the non-recovered expenses that they're facing, the city has elected to decrease it by 80%. I don't want to go too much into detail on that, but again, it all fits to a larger picture of what we're talking about in the valuation, especially of the Class A's and B's in downtown Winnipeg. We've gone through a market rent analysis of the property. I'll just read a quote that comes from the Cushman-Wakefield report that we're discussing and questioning. Landlords in the CBD will need to be aggressive as tenants pursue opportunities for superior quality space or more attractive leasing terms. The key factors in the decision-making process by tenants will be the leasehold improvement allowance and the commitment by landlords to undertake significant building upgrades, kind of speaking to what I just mentioned. But we went through an analysis of the Class B rents, both an analysis of what the city has submitted and our own analysis. I have some rebuttal evidence here, if I may pass around now. And I'm just going to be very quick because I think we've gone through this before.
I think you're pretty much agreeing with the rents that the city's giving.
Actually, to be honest, Mr. Chairman, I'm higher.
I know.
Yeah, and that's our approach. So I want to be very transparent about that. So you're right, this is probably a moot point, but I think it's still important to point out. What we've done here as part of our analysis is go through the city's rents, and we've excluded what we feel are not comparable. We've made adjustments to the rents that were semi-gross. We've excluded main floor retail. We excluded suburban offices that would have parking included. And we come to something slightly less. And this is part of our internal analysis. We've also looked at spaces on our own on page 8. we've gone through the actual performance of the property itself. We maintain, and this has been an item of discussion this round, that in a fee simple valuation, we agree a market rent approach is used, but the best indicator of the market is the rents actually achieved for the property itself, unless there's a reason to veer, or to decide otherwise, old leases, non-arm's length leases, etc. All of this is part of our analysis, Mr. Chairman, and in the end, with market rents applied, you'll see on page 9 that we come out with a market potential income greater than the city. And we're using that as part of our valuation. But there are risks associated with that income that have to be recognized. We're recognizing it in the vacancy allowance. The reason is, on page 10 you'll see, that the property may be sitting at 16% vacancy today, today being the reference date. It's actually worse today, but I can't talk about that. But the history of this property has been consistently poor occupancy. They're struggling to try and get it to 16, and 16 isn't sustainable because they're about to lose some of the tenants that we just went through the analysis on. So my point is that if we're going to do our job to try and bring you a fair valuation and we come forward with a higher potential income, at the same time we have to be realistic about the risks that that income has. The city has been quite good, and I'll commend them on this. They've recognized the vacancy issues in the property with a 15% allowance. That's not sufficient though. This property has difficulties and is walking into a storm that's going to make it worse. We're asking for an increase on the vacancy based on the stabilized history, which over 5 years was 22% and over 3 years is 19.33%. And keeping in mind that the last cycle, 20% was applied, we're asking for 17% today. Higher rent, higher vacancy. We've gone through an analysis of the shortfall rate, and actually in this case, they're very close. The actual expenses are very close to what the city's used, so we accept the shortfall rate. So the last big contentious item is that 7% allowance for non-recovered. I've just given you the background of what's happening in the market. I think it is, what's the right word? Illogical. At this moment especially, to add insult to injury, that allowance would be reduced. Mr. Chairman, with your permission, I won't go through our entire study because I think everybody here has heard it.
Yeah.
But let me just touch upon the main points. These are real expenses that properties incur. These are expenses that cannot be recovered from the tenants. They're necessary to attain the income that I'm presenting to you as part of the valuation. They are recognized in appraisal theory. They are recognized as a deduction in other assessment jurisdictions. They were even defined by the City of Winnipeg Assessment Department as being exactly what they are, non-recovered expenses, up until that definition was omitted and it simply was left with the title. Long story short is, there is no way that 2% is sufficient when you take a look at all of the non-recovered expenses that I'm contemplating, as well as structural reserve over the life of the building. I can tell you in this case, is nowhere near sufficient. What I should really be doing is coming forward with all the things that they intend on doing, which is a considerable amount of investment. But as Mr. Pohl had said, those are really capital improvements. They're not deferred maintenance like we discussed with 20 Taylor. But the fact is, it's money that if I buy the building today, I know I got to spend. Am I going to ignore that? There's no way that I would ignore that expense. At the very least, I'd amortize it over the life of the building, which has been the practice in other assessment jurisdictions and has been the practice by the City Assessment Department. And we suggest 100% that allowance should be reinstated at 7%. No contention on the cap rate of 6.75%, as long as we recognize these factors I'm discussing in other areas of the valuation, vacancy allowance. And so, Mr. Chairman, in conclusion, on page 18, with our higher market rent, with our higher vacancy allowance, and with the reinstated 7% for non-recovered expenses, we still look at approximately $1 million, definitely worth the owner's while to be contesting this assessment. Difference in value. When adding in the school tax exempt portion, we have a total value of $19,868,000, which is broken down as $16,189,000 for the fully taxable portion and $3,680,000 for the school tax exempt. I I don't think I'll go through any of the appendix, it's just supporting information about our analysis. So, thank you.
Jeremy?
I just got a quick question, a few questions, not far out, but, can you go to cap rate study?
Yes.
We've already had 423 Main under appeal, you and myself. We've already went through it. I looked at the building, I chose not to include it as a capitalization rate. Basically, as I felt that it was a class action lawsuit that was involved with the people, membership of Canadian people basically claiming it as their own. And also the leasehold of Canadian support for the top 2 floors and a portion of the building. So at that point, I backed away from market. I looked at other properties, I looked at 200 Portage. 200 Portage was actually, it was owner occupied by Scotiabank. They produced a sales questionnaire that said it was leasehold, lease back. And then they went vacant right after it. We checked up with property management, they bought it at $2 million, they filled out the sales questionnaire, no capitalization right there. But I also looked at 2 other properties that don't show up, prominent properties that don't show up in your study. That would be in my brief, 294 Portage and 177 Lombard.
Page?
Last 2 pages. Did you happen to look at 294 Portage? Did you happen to look at 177 Lombard?
Yeah, we look at every sale on the market, and like you, we'll make a determination of whether we think an appropriate cap rate can be generated.
So what didn't you like about those 2 sales? I personally think these 2, 5.88% is 5-year stabilized, and 177 Lombard is 6.35 is actually 6.38 when I calculated it, but they reported it as 6.35. All parameters looked at 6.35.
Yeah, before I answer that directly, Mr. Poole, I'll start by stating that, A, we have no contention with the city's cap rate of 6.75 for this building. B, the city's own conclusions that you've included from your model state that between the 20th and the 80th percentile, Class Bs perform at 6.75%. C, all of the broker reports seem to corroborate that conclusion at 6.75%. Anytime we look at a cap rate, the thing is, first of all, any sale, you get 5 appraisers looking at a sale, you'll probably get 6 opinions of cap rate. It all depends on how you treat the income in place, if you stabilize it, if you do this, if you take the income as it is at the time, etc. Cap rates can vary significantly, sale-to-sale basis, for all sorts of site-specific factors. Now, to answer your direct question about those 2 sales, 294 Portage was an acquisition by Canad Inns from Public Capital. They also own the Metropolitan Theatre, immediately adjacent on one side, and the Radisson Inn on the other side. It was, in our opinion, a very motivated sale to acquire control of that corner. That's the number 1 reason we wouldn't consider it. The second thing is, and actually you brought up this point earlier, and it was a very good point. When you look at capitalization rate, you have to understand as well that one of the factors that an investor is looking at is not just the sustainability of the income, but the chance to appreciate the income. So for example, if you had a shopping mall, other shopping malls may perform at a 6% cap rate, but somebody paid 5 for this one. Why is that? They may have recognized that there's pad site potential, and they can generate additional income. This is something that investors, REITs, pension funds, and those active in the large market have been very focused on in the last while. And it's for that reason, Mr. McIntyre, you know this well, that you can have an old apartment building that actually will perform at a very low cap rate. It's actually performing poorly. The sale price per foot is deceivingly low, but it sells for a low cap rate because the investor recognizes the upside potential. It's something that we have to recognize in all of these. 294 Portage is a great example. I know this because I did the assessment on the property for 2018 for the vendor. The average rents in that property are under $9 a square foot. This property is exactly like the subject property, but on the other side of the arena. It is a Class C because it's older, but the location is perfect. If I was an investor like Canad Inns, I own the 2 properties on either side, I would see a huge upside and potential for this site. The point is, the sale price per foot of that property was $78 a square foot. You have that in your evidence. What I'm suggesting for the subject property is double that. My point being, you can be thrown askew by looking at one cap rate and thinking that that gives a
So
indication of
basically,
market.
you just didn't want to include 2 cap rates that were, my calculation, 5.88 and 6.35 inclusive within your study? or is it?
No, I
just
wouldn't
that?
include a motivated sale like that. For the upside, I would have included and described to the panel why I feel that's a low cap rate. But when it's a motivated sale,
Because the property owner is taking advantage of being around the driving economics of the NPS center. the Shell
no,
district.
because they've already acquired the
That's marked.
properties on either side.
Yeah, but that's marked, the owner of particular candidates is trying to get more of ground there. So that's not motivated for, because I own this or that, that's simply market. That,
Well, I disagree, because market, I don't think anybody else would have paid that price for it if they didn't own the adjacent properties.
right.
I'm not saying it's a non-arm's length sale,
And
I'm
not that
saying
we're
use
far off,
caution.
not that we're far off, but this touches base back what you stated on 55 Princess. If I heard this right, you said you have an elevated rent over what we have, so you have to have an elevated vacancy to account for the rent.
No, I said that,
The higher rent means higher vacancy.
no,
Chance
I
of
said
higher
that we're
vacancy.
looking at the site-specific performance of the property. And we've been very transparent in saying that we actually think the income is higher than what the city's used, but also the vacancy
So that's why
performance
you
is
want the
higher.
vacancy to be a bit higher than what we put in.
No, it's because the actual vacancy performance of the property is higher.
Fair enough.
Done? Cynthia?
I think I'm good, thank you.
Brent?
So, let me get this straight. So in your report, you've selected to use the city's shortfall, even though shortfall is higher than this, so.
Yeah, the actual expenses are just over $11 a foot. The market shortfall rate is 11. When it's that close together, we usually don't veer off. It's if the actual expenses were $16 or something, we'd probably suggest we should be looking at a higher shortfall allowance.
Okay, that was it.
When you talked about potential, so when they bought the property back in 2006, 2007, they knew about the ice shack going next door, right?
Yep, would have been well underway.
So they were looking at that potential. How many floors have they already remodeled since then? They've done some remodeling. How many have they done?
They've just started. I think they're doing some hallways and washrooms. Over the next couple of years, you'll see significant improvements in that property. But they haven't really got going on yet.
So since they bought it, they haven't done any,
Oh, since they bought it in 2005? The property basically seems pretty much the same as far as I can tell. I was in that building years and years ago. And one of our clients is occupied that building, so I'm there quite often. And they've done the obvious maintenance, but I wouldn't suggest they've done any significant capital improvements that I'm aware of anyway.
but you gotta say the location is pretty good where it is.
Yep, and I'm recognizing all of that in the analysis.
So what was your average rent that you put on yours then? The city did 13 and change, I think.
I had, without the regional health authority space, the average was 1334, and for regional health authority space, the average was 1437, so probably averages to around 1360 overall.
And yet you got the actual rents in there are $14.50 and $13.91.
In where?
The actual rents are $14.50 and $13.91.
The actual rents for the entire building, or?
No, for, yeah, well, the office spaces on that one.
Well, yeah, there's a range. There's rents that are as low as $11.16 to a high of main floor space, and the walkways are higher, but typically, yeah, about 60. So there's a range there.
So were we taking, I know you're higher than the city, so it's awkward for me to say. They were using their comparisons.
To answer your question about the market rents that we examined, we come out at an average of about $12 a foot for Class B, and I think our revised version of the city's evidence puts them at an average of about between 12 and 13.
1393. Okay. This isn't the one. Okay, we'll leave it at that. Thank you very much for your presentation.
Thank you.
I'm gonna do the calculations after. I'm tired of trying to think about it. Here comes Fultz, correct?
Foltz is going to be withdrawing this.
Withdrawn.
Well, that's, the next one's market.
Hey, so you're going to sign off on that later?
Can't read that. What time is it? It's not very-
It's
It's not
11:07.
right.
It's not right.
Yeah.
So don't go by that clock, you'll be here till midnight.
Whatever, it's 5 minutes.
What's this? What am I going to do?
Can I just get?
Yes, we can do that. Let's take a 5-minute break. Let's call it back to order. We're dealing with Market, correct? Okay, 136 Market. When you're ready, Jeremy?
136 Market, file number 192989. Roll number is 130990690035. The 2020 assessment is for $18,630,000. There's a split, $268,000 for class code 40, the remainder for class code 60. The building was built in 1905, has an effective year of 1975. The number of stories is 19. Leasable area in the property is 49,000 square feet approximately. You turn to my page 11. It's aerial photo of the property. It's on market for me. And then 2 other pictures of the property. Following page 13 is the rent roll. Again, a little small, I apologize for the format, I can read that. And on the following pages, information that we have. After that, we have a recent lease in place. They skip the dishes. Signed in March of 17. On page 19, highlighted in yellow, the current rent is $11.50. The expected rent, as we go down years 4 and 5, will be $12.50. Again, that's projected, it's not actually occurred yet, but. So $11.50 for skip the dishes. If we get back to our comparables on page 3. I guess at this point I could probably hand out, there's some contentious issue with Altus wanting a few rents taken out of our analysis. I happen to adjust those today. I'm sure Altus has no objection for me reviewing a few of the rents.
Moving, if nothing's changed, but.
I can speak to them as if they're in the same. So I just.
Pass them. You're changing.
No, I'm just highlighting, there's a few rents that are apparent that, in my opinion, should still be included in, but with the removal of
Thank you.
195 Fort and 1790 Wellington.
What number are they?
Which number's on here?
They're,
Oh, you got them.
well, they're multiples.
They've gone in this one.
Yeah, they're gone.
So we're not looking, so we're using this, not this.
No, I'm still saying this is still a reflection of market what's
Okay,
here. I'm
alright.
just simply showing the contrasting difference between removing those that were in contention at last hearing, that of the 50 comparables, which are now reduced to 39, of the 50, it was $12.13 for an average square foot, weighted average of $12.80 and a median of 12. With those 11 comparables taken out, it shifts somewhat, but not significantly. I believe it's about a 6% reduction. Average is $11.43. Weighted average is basically $12 and a median of $11.50. So those 2 properties really did not shift the overall by all that much, is what I'm. So, we get back to page 4, again, Cushman Wakefield lists their Class C for the Center Business District for overseas for $11.45. We have on page 5, vacancy report with Johnson report for 136 Market. Highlighted, you know, what it is, right? It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 up in the bottom. And they have about 1,000 square feet advertised at $23 net for main floor rent. Not that I'm saying it's $23 net for the building at all. Find that out. On page 6 are workups, 7-hour workups for the class code 60 space. We have 147,661 square feet at $11.01, so well within our range. That produces a potential gross rent of $1,626,196. Capped at 10.5%, or applied 10.5 vacancy. Gives us an effective gross income at $1,455,445. Expenses at 2% and shortfall at $850 gives us our net operating income of $1,294,549, capped at 7.05%, gives us $18,362,000 rounded. For the class code 40E space, which is one tenant, 1,550 square feet at $12.95 a square foot, gives us the same, one second here. Apologize, that should be 7.5, not, or 7.05 cap at the bottom, not 6. Just give it one moment. So that would reduce this value by to $230,113. Apologize for that. I missed that. Again, all the same parameters except for that one adjustment in cap. I'm not sure how that would have happened. That would be $38,000 reduction off the top. So this income stream should have produced an estimated value of $230,000 rounded. So on our next page, is the summary full income streams. Give me one moment to make an adjustment. With that correction, it should be $18,592,000. So that's the value I'll recommend that we reduce to. Not much, it's just, so getting back to the overall performance of the building, I think our market rent is in line with what we put on the building is in line with market. It's in line with one of the leases that occurred within the property at $11.50. And with that, I think our assessment's fair and reasonable. So with that, I'm open to questions.
Rod?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Poole, on the last property we discussed, at 330 Portage Avenue, the city had applied a vacancy allowance to recognize the site-specific experience, an increased allowance of 15%. You agree that the site-specific experience for vacancy in this property is far worse than 330 Portage,
Correct.
and yet the city is maintaining the market vacancy allowance in this case, 10.5%.
Correct.
Those are all the questions.
Brad,
I have no question.
Cynthia,
The exempt space, is that the city of Winnipeg?
No, that was,
No, it
until
was-
the building construction insurance.
Oh, okay, yeah.
application.
You sure? I think it is city one.
1,500 square foot.
I noticed the city of Winnipeg on the rent roll somewhere, so.
Because the city would be fully exempt,
Yeah.
so I think that's the one.
Thought I noticed it somewhere, but that's.
Should be the city.
Yeah, it's on the rent roll.
Okay, sorry,
Okay.
my mistake.
And so that space is being shown at a higher square foot rate than the rest of the building. Is that based on an actual or just,
No, that would have just been the
it's
smaller space.
just the model because it's a smaller space? Yeah, okay, all right, that's it, thanks.
You're good, I'm good, on your presentation, Rod.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Page 2 is a photograph of the building. It's a multi-story heritage building originally built in 1905. With the upgrades to the building, the city considers the very age of 1975. It's 8 stories plus full basement. Page 3 is showing where it's located at the corner of Market and Rory. I won't reiterate any of the property description. Mr. Bull's gone through that, so I'll just get right to the main point. This is very similar to the presentation for the last property, in that we have looked at not only market evidence, and thank you, Mr. Pohl, for the revised Class C. That actually now comes in very close to ours. So both sides have done market analysis. I don't think we're far off in that conclusion. But again, we look at site-specific performance as well. And in the end, we actually have done an analysis between market and actual to conclude that the potential gross income, in our mind, that should actually be $1,885,042. It's about $200,000 higher than what the model had derived. So off the top, we're looking for a higher value. But page...
One way to appeal it.
Yeah.
Okay, you're done.
It was really short. Thank you.
Next.
Page 9 is the summary of the vacancy. This property has had a severe vacancy experience, even worse than 330 Portage. You'll see the performance since December 2010, when it was at its lowest point ever at 15.35. Since then, it's shot up, and it has not been under 25% since. This is what we consider a chronic vacancy experience. Stabilized 5 years is 36%, 3 years stabilized is 34.14%. If I can ask you to turn to page 40. You'll see that this property was before the board of revision in 2018. And the board had agreed with the appellant that the vacancy rate in that case should be 25%. Today, we're asking for a vacancy allowance of 20%. While the vacancy has improved, it's still far beyond market standards. It still is sitting above 25%. We feel 20% would be acceptable. On page 10, we have only a very small discrepancy in the shortfall allowance being applied $8.50. The actual expenses in 2017 comes to $10.50 a square foot. We typically apply a shortfall rate that is close to but slightly less than the actual performance, with the understanding there are some expenses that might not be incurred on vacant space. So we're asking for a slight increase to $9 in the shortfall rate. Again, we are very strong in the opinion that there's no justification for a decrease in the non-recovered expense allowance from 7% to 2%. And for the reasons outlined in our 150-page report that will spare you the details on.
Oh, come on.
Unless you want.
No, that's okay.
Okay, we ask for a reinstatement of 7%. The last minor contention is our analysis of capitalization rates in the market are not far off from what the city has. Class A, we had a bit of a discrepancy on for various reasons. We came up with a conclusion slightly higher of 7.5% for Class C, but it's not significantly different. But where we do differ is that when it's a heritage status building, for the reasons outlined earlier today, we feel that it is justified to apply an increase to the capitalization rate. And in this case, we feel that our conclusions, our original conclusions on cap rate of 7.5% actually should be applied in this case because of the fact it's a heritage status. I'll mention again that two of the comparisons that we do outline, and again, these aren't the only sales in the market, but they're ones that we felt were appropriate to look at, and basically aren't given much weight. They're used to corroborate the findings of both the city, ourselves, and the brokers. But two of them are interestingly heritage buildings. On page 15, you'll see the Paris building. And although we have a difference of opinion on the Canadian Wheat Board building, I'm completely of the opinion that this is a market sale. And again, that's because I was involved in the due diligence for another purchaser on this property. I know all of the circumstances in the sale. And I know that one of the factors in both of these cases, because we represent both properties, that doesn't explain the capitalization rates here, but certainly add to the investor's rate of return expectations, is heritage status. So we do feel that the Calgary Assessment Review Board was on the right track. We do think that this is something that causes unease in investors. And for these reasons, we ask that there should be a premium added, in this case of 45 basis points, because it brings us to what our original conclusions were on Class C for a 7.5% capitalization rate. So when you put all those factors together, Mr. Chairman, on page 17, a higher rent, a higher vacancy, very slight difference in shortfall, the reinstated 7% unrecovered, and a slightly higher capitalization rate of 7.5% for heritage status, we have a revised value of $15,136,000, in which case $105,000 is the city's portion would be exempt. So again, it's a lower exemption as well we're asking. I don't think I'll go through the entire appendix. We have all the financials and evidence and the same decision surrounding heritage status. So I'll conclude there, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much.
Questions?
No questions. I just have the rebuttal package to submit for these properties. I guess I should have done it at the beginning. Well, we've already touched on the 10% versus the 2%.
Yes.
So if that could just be filed with each and every one of the appeals today.
This one here?
Yeah, I think if I didn't give enough, I'm sure you've seen it. So
Yeah.
if you need more, I got.
No, I don't even need to. We've seen many things.
Yes. You said this is for each file?
Yeah, I have copies.
Okay, I'll need that for
We've got an extra one if we need it.
Yeah, I think it's at a point where we're all very comfortable with the material. We'll see it, although we will be having an updated version for all this is full comparable list. It's almost finished now, so.
Then we'll have a long meeting again.
It's not over yet?
The battle's only just begun. Cynthia, do you have any questions?
No, thank you.
No questions.
No questions? On your, and it's on the tax exempt side, but do you drop the rent down to average of the rest of the building, I take it?
No, it's based on the actual rent.
Or you use the actual?
Yeah. So yeah, the exemption is less than the city.
The other one is. I'm good. Very well explained, Dylan. Guess what, I'm getting close. I lost my paper clip. And the next one will be withdrawn,
Correct.
folks. I can do this. And the last item on the docket today. So it's 11:35, but we can continue through, right?
This will be short.
Yeah, I don't have much here.
you're okay with going through?
Yeah.
Let's deal with 123 Main Street.
File number 19-1871. Roll number is 1209778850. 123 Main Street. Owned by Boardroom Canada, the train station. It says 2020 assessment is for $17,926. The building was originally built in 1909. We have an effective year built in 1958. There's a leasable floor area of $169,394. And there's $169,394 square feet. And we have an outdoor stall count on the property of 168 stalls. Before we go further, please turn to my page 6, or page 11. Like I said, I'm off today. We all know this building, I'm sure everyone's driven on it, been inside it. Rent roll is attached. Parts that are occupied. Rent roll is as such. Predominantly gross leases. When we look at this property, and I'll go over the comparables first, page 3. Same comparables for OC that we just seen. You want to choose the adjusted rent, adjusted comparables rent. We have an average of $12.13, a weighted average of $12.80, and a median of 12. And as you see on page 5, we have the outdoor stall count, or outdoor stall rates, those are the 168 stall count. I don't think there'd be any potential with parking, so if we get the actual building itself, on page 60, man, I am way off.
66.
I said I had like 3 hours sleep last night, it's been a bad day, so. Page 6.
Yeah, like visible.
Jeez. We have 169,392 square feet. We've downgraded the rent to reflect the actual building itself. We have a 4-inch stream quality. We put it to $7.32 a square foot. So again, that's 40% or so below market. And then we put our standard parameters on it. We've adjusted for the lower market rent or the lower applied rent. We have a vacancy of 10.5%, expenses at 2%, which produces a net operating income of $936,845. Capped at 7.05% gives us a capitalized value for the building at $13,289,000. Parking lot are staying downtown parameter standards for outside parking this go round for the center business district, which is $103.50. Has 168 stalls, which produces a net operating income of $208,656, capped at 4.5%, gives us $4,637,000. And on the following page 8 is a summary of the two income streams. So $17,926,000 is the value that we're applying here today. We've adjusted for the market rent, which would go back to the market to the $7 range. So. With that, I'll open the questions.
Questions?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Pohl, you mentioned there's 168 outdoor stalls, that's what's being assessed.
Correct.
On page 12 of your evidence, the income expense mailer that was provided. And just to be clear, we've heard this morning and at other hearings that if if the owner doesn't complete things like number of stalls or monthly rate or put in the income, that you'll seek a penalty.
Within reason, yeah.
It's considered a failure to not do so. And in this case, they've provided you all that information. But what they provided you also is a stall count, which is significantly different than what you've assessed.
This is not what we have on file.
I guess, a kind of concerning question I have is the penalty, are these really necessary for you to properly value the property, or is it simply a conduit for seeking the penalty?
No, 168 is what we have on file, what we historically had. If there's a difference in install count, that would be the reporting install count. That would not be for a non-compliance matter, that would be for inconsistent information.
But when they tell you that it's something different, do you not think it's appropriate to correct install count?
I did not catch that, to be quite honest with you.
No, that's fair, that's fair.
I
That's all.
reviewed what we had on file and cross-referenced it to other appeals. I didn't see any change. So was there a stall count change?
I don't know, I just know it's 143 stalls. That's all my questions.
No questions.
Questions? Good.
Just, you mentioned you adjusted the rent, so that's based on the age, the condition?
I didn't, like, we did it in a preliminary review of the model, so we adjusted it.
Yes.
I didn't physically adjust it.
No, but okay, but it was adjusted
Yeah, it
based
was
on the
adjusted.
age and the condition of the building, is that?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, that's it, thanks.
Good. I'm with your presentation.
Okay, one last question, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Pohl, does the city have any evidence to support the 4.5% cap rate for the parking lot?
Not today.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Page 2, this is the Union Station down Main Street here. And I'm going to keep this very short. On page 3, you can see how the station is situated and then the parking lot just to the north. We had done an analysis on the actual building valuation, and while we have areas within that valuation of contention with the city around capitalization rate, because of heritage stats, around non-recovered expenses, there was also uncertainties around some of the income. So long story short is, in the end, we decided to accept the city's value on the building. Not necessarily the rates or allowances included in that valuation, but the overall value. So the only contention I have today is with the parking lot, and it's fairly simple. There are not 168 stalls, there's 143. The monthly rate, when we take that amount, would indicate a value, or an income, sorry, much lower than what the city's using. If I can ask you to turn to page 7. We've done an analysis of surface parking rents. These are collected gross, and then there will be expenses which have to be deducted to come down to the net amount. The median of the surface lot gross rents that we looked at was $185. Again, the monthly rate at the subject property is $140, less than that. On page 8, we did an analysis, and I think we're probably consistent with the city on this, I'm not sure, but typically the expenses for parking lots total around 45%, and that's typically the expense allowance that's applied. So from the gross rent, we would then deduct 45% of expenses to come to a net amount. If we use their actual stated rent of $140 per stall, the net amount then would become $77. But what I think is happening here is they probably have additional income because of their location. There's probably additional evening parking. Because what they have included in their submission to the city on the income and expense form is the total parking amount for the year. And it's consistent, fairly consistent year over year, and that's $317,673. So to be fair, we would not just take their monthly rate and deduct expenses. We're going to look at the lump sum total and then apply the expense ratio. That brings us to 101.82, which is actually very close to what the city's using. So all of this to say, really our contention is the city should have corrected stall count. But lastly, once we determine that income, 143 stalls brings us to 174,720 as our total net income. Our last contention is that we don't see the evidence to support a capitalization drop of what has been 50 basis points from the 5% used last cycle to what is now being proposed at 4.5%. Again, our evidence shows that for other asset classes, there has been no compression. We don't see any evidence around the parking lot. We did an analysis of 4 sales on page 9. And these cap rates range from a low of 4.6 but to a high of 8.05. And again, you're gonna have large variances in cap rates. One of the things with parking lots that we try and be cautious about is what is an investor really buying? And oftentimes, a parking lot may be the interim use, and somebody pays a lot of money because there's great potential to develop something else on that site. So you get into, are we really comparing apples to apples? But with these sales, we feel it gives us a fairly good indication that there should not have been a compression in the capitalization rate for surface parking lots from 5 to 4.5%. We asked the board to maintain a 5% rate. And that's it, Mr. Chairman. The only contentions are the correction of the stall count and a increase to the cap rate on the parking only. We accept the building value. So the total value that we're proposing is $16,783,000 as shown on page 10. And that concludes our presentation.
Questions?
Yeah, just the one, stall count.
Yeah.
Did you contact the owner? Did you verify this with the owner?
I did.
Or is it just reading from the IE, which sometimes has varying stall counts from year to year? Not this particular property, but any particular property. There's anomalies on different IEs.
Yeah, no, here I say, this is to the Vincent Willett Morissette at Via Rail. The 2017 rent roll shows 143 outdoor stalls, and I guess what happened is in my examination of post-reference information in 2018, it arose to 90. And I said, why did the stall count stall count decline? And he says that that's because of ones that they started renting out. So 147 was the top number, and then it actually eroded since then. He gave no indication that it should be more.
147 was the top?
Sorry, 143.
143. Who did they rent the remaining, what did it drop down to?
On the rent roll for 2018, it erodes to 90. So I was asking if they did something to actually physically remove those stalls. He said no, they just,
Who did they rent them out to?
I don't know, Mr. Paul, I didn't ask. I didn't think it was really important because it's post-reference.
I'll look into this back. All right, only question I had.
Question? Right?
No question.
No, I don't have anything.
Just on the, I do have to ask the question, on the management, you left it at 2%.
Yeah, as I mentioned, I went back and forth on the valuation of the building, and there are things that I don't like in the actual allowances and the rates, but I had some questions about the rental income. And in the end, my value, after making my proper deductions and increasing the cap rate, came out pretty close. Not exact, but I got to the point where I thought, do I really want to go through all this for something that's very close in value? And I decided, for the purpose of this report, just to accept the city's value overall, not the rates or allowances.
Well, no, you're accepting the rates and allowances by leaving it sit like that.
How do I word this then? I propose a valuation with different allowances for the building.
You should, I mean, you can't ask for one thing and then try and change it
I'll
partway through the
take
game.
some pressure off them. I'll take some pressure. Every now and again, when I review a property, if I come up with it be slightly higher than what our market level is, I'm not gonna ask for an increase. It's a nominal difference. If it's slightly below, I'm not gonna ask for a recommend a reduction. It's within a range that's acceptable for projection from what I review. If it's outside of that, I'll ask for an increase. If it's underneath, I'll recommend a reduction. So I think what he's saying in this particular case here is close enough that they're acceptable.
Well, it's because I think the market rent, if I really went through it, might be a bit higher. So I take off my allowance for the non-recovered, I adjust the cap rate, but I'm still basically back in the same place. So this is a fair comment, Mr. Chairman. In the future, I should show you what I'm thinking.
Yes, you should.
Yeah,
Uh,
but for brevity.
Because this can come back and haunt us at a later date when somebody brings it back and says it was accepted, wasn't it?
I'm hoping that I'm pretty sure that Altus's position from a broad sense is they want 5% back in. I don't think this in particular, this appeal will be used at a municipal board that will say you brought it green.
If you want, I can send you something where
No,
I
I'm
can
not-
increase, I can send you a valuation if you want.
No,
on
no,
the record.
no, as long as you're aware that I asked the question, it's on the record.
Yeah, no, I will state then on the record that our opinion is 100% that the expense allowance should be 7% in every case.
Thank you, that's all I wanted to hear.
Thank you.
That'll conclude the matter. Shut her down for now. And we're gonna decide if we're gonna break our sandwich. Okay? You could probably use a sandwich, I think.
I'm good with going right through, but
I'm good with
it's
it,
up
too.
to you.